The first thing you noticed when you saw Amos Carver's tent wasn't the canvas. It was the smoke rising from the small iron stove, a gray spiral curling into the frozen Wyoming sky, stark against the barren winter landscape. Out here, 50 miles from the nearest town, you learned fast that smoke meant life. Fire meant survival. Most of the frontier cabins in the valley sat silent and frostbitten, their chimneys empty, their windows dark. But Amos' tent, staked into the snow-packed soil at a ridiculous angle, the canvas patched in odd colors and textures, glowed. Literally glowed. It looked as if the sun had found it early and refused to leave. Amos leaned against a drifted fence post, mustache frosted at the edges, his boots sunk halfway into the snow. He had a lean build, arms like twisted rope, shoulders stooped from decades of carrying feed, water, and wood. He squinted through the icy wind at a neighbor trudging across the pasture with a team of horses. "Hurry up," he called, voice low but carrying. "You'll freeze your soul before you hit the tent." The neighbor, a younger man named Silas, stumbled forward, coat caked with snow, beard frosted stiff as wire. "Amos, how does it stay warm in there?" he asked, voice cracking with cold. He gestured at the tent, as if accusing it of witchcraft. "I've seen cabins 10 times the size shiver themselves into collapse, but your thing, it's like a furnace." Amos shrugged, adjusting the rope that held the windward flap. "It's just thinking ahead," he said. His voice was calm, almost bored, but the corners of his eyes crinkled with the hint of amusement. "Most people pack logs and hope for the best. Me, I pack a tent with a plan." A gust hit, whipping snow into a fine white powder. Silas shivered violently. "A plan?" he repeated. "Amos, it's 45 below out here. My cabin's warmer than this hell, and it's falling apart." Amos didn't argue. He rarely did. Instead, he tapped the side of the canvas with a gloved hand. "You'll see." Inside, the tent was deceptively cozy. The canvas walls were lined with layers of animal hides, hay, and even some aluminum sheets Amos had scavenged over the years from abandoned wagons. The stove sat low, its iron body blackened with soot, radiating an even comforting heat. It wasn't just warmth, it was a living thing. Every inch of the interior felt deliberate. The floor was raised slightly with planks, insulating from the frozen ground. Corners held barrels of supplies and stacks of blankets. In one corner, a small pile of firewood sat meticulously organized by size. Everything had its place. Everything existed for one purpose: survival. Amos sat down on a simple wooden stool, rubbing his hands together over the stove. The small space smelled of pine, smoke, and something earthy, dirt and hay, and the faint musk of animals. "You can feel it, can't you?" he said, glancing at Silas, who was still leaning against the tent flap, wide-eyed and frozen. "The air, it's thick, not bitter. That's heat staying put, not wandering." Silas nodded slowly, finally daring to step inside. It's warmer than my cabin's living room," he said, voice hushed. I don't understand." Amos smiled faintly, a weathered grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Most folks don't. They've forgotten how to build for winter. You throw logs together, slap some nails in, and hope you don't die. Out here, hope doesn't cut it." He leaned closer to the stove, his breath forming a small cloud in the tent. "Winter's a thief. It'll take heat, life, cattle, even your mind if you let it. You've got to cheat it, trick it, respect it." Outside, the wind screamed across the valley. Snow drifted in long, unbroken waves, piling against the cabins and barns that dotted the open expanse. Amos had spent the last 30 years learning its rhythms. He could read the creak of a frozen tree like a newspaper, tell when the snow would crust over enough to support a horse, or when it would suck him down to his knees. The old log cabins, built by men who only knew summer, were no match for it. That's why people laughed at him when he started putting up his tent in the wrong direction on the flat. Wrong? Not if you know the wind, not if you know winter. The tent flap rustled. Amos looked up to see his niece, Clara, stepping into the warmth. She was 16, tall for her age, with dark hair tucked beneath a knitted cap and eyes too old for a teenager, the kind that had seen hunger and disappointment. She carried a small basket of supplies from the snow, balancing it carefully on gloved hands. "Uncle Amos," she said, voice tinged with awe, "you weren't kidding. This place, it's warm." "I'm always kidding," Amos said, smirking, "except when I'm not." The fire in the stove crackled, sending a glow across the canvas walls. Shadows danced on the hay-lined corners, flickering like ghosts. Outside, the storm had begun in earnest, and the valley groaned under the weight of snow. Amos pulled a thick wool blanket around his shoulders. "I've got a feeling this one's going to be bad," he murmured. Clara frowned, placing the basket beside the stove. "How bad?" Amos let out a dry chuckle, rubbing his hands together. "Worst in decades. They'll write about it in the papers if any of the townsfolk survive without frostbite first." Clara's mouth opened, then closed. She wasn't sure what to say. She'd heard of winters like this in hushed stories, around fireplaces in cabins where the elders spoke with reverence and fear. She'd never seen it herself, until now. "Why a tent, Uncle?" she asked finally, curiosity tinged with worry. "Why not just build something proper?" Amos gestured toward the wall. "Because this is proper, just in a way people have forgotten." He tapped the canvas again. "A log cabin holds heat like a bucket holds water. It leaks at every crack. It's layered. Every inch has a purpose. You get the layers right, you get the heat right. And if the wind tries to bite, it can know all it wants. It won't touch us inside." A gust rattled the tent, but the interior remained serene. Heat pooled around them like a shield. Silas let out a low whistle. "You've built a fortress," he said. Amos tilted his head, studying the way the snow beat against the canvas. "A tent's only a fortress if the builder remembers that winter doesn't negotiate. It teaches," he sighed. "And I've learned plenty over the years. If you survive winters like this, you get to call yourself a student." The three of them sat around the stove in a companionable silence. Outside, the storm began hammering against the landscape with a white fury. But inside the tent, everything felt deliberate, intentional, alive. A strange, almost magical warmth clung to them. It wasn't fire alone. It was the knowledge, the craft, the stubborn insistence of a man who refused to let winter win. Night began to fall. The snow turned blue in the fading light, drifts rising into soft, treacherous shapes. Amos lit another lantern, placing it carefully on a wooden crate. Its yellow glow mingled with the firelight, softening the edges of the canvas walls. "We'll eat soon," he said, reaching for a pot of stew. "But I want you to remember this. Out here, you respect the storm, you respect the cold, or it will bury you. People laugh at me. They always do. But when the wind howls like a beast outside, you'll see why planning matters." Silas shook his head, staring at the stove. "I don't know if I've ever been this warm in February," he admitted. "And it's kind of insane, but it works." Amos nodded, letting a faint smile cross his face. "Insane until it doesn't." He ladled stew into tin bowls, the aroma mingling with smoke and hay and the sharp scent of the winter night outside. Clara handed out spoons. They ate quietly, listening to the wind, feeling the heat, savoring the small victory of staying alive in the heart of a winter that would break the unprepared. Later, Amos stood outside for a moment, looking back at the tent. The snow swirled, creating a gray haze, but the small canvas structure held its shape, stubborn and stubbornly warm. He ran a gloved hand along the rope securing the stakes. "You're going to teach them," he whispered softly. "Show them there's a way to survive." And in the shadowed valley where log cabins groaned and froze, Amos' tent remained a beacon, 45 degrees warmer, a defiance of the cold, a lesson in patience, craft, and stubborn ingenuity. The wind howled. The storm was only beginning, and Amos smiled faintly, knowing that the real test was still ahead. The morning came cold and merciless, the kind of cold that gnawed at bone and made breath hang in thick, icy clouds. Amos Carver emerged from his tent, boots crunching on the crusted snow, eyes narrowing against the glaring white of the Wyoming plains. The world beyond the tent seemed almost alien, everything flattened and muted under a coat of frost, fences disappearing into drifting mounds, the skeletal remains of trees shivering in the wind. Yet inside his canvas walls, warmth clung stubbornly like a loyal dog, a reminder that preparation mattered. Amos set to work immediately, checking the perimeter of his small camp. The stakes holding the tent had shifted under the weight of last night's drift. He adjusted them with precision, hammering snow-packed earth back into place. The wind tried to steal heat even here, pushing and whistling in frustrated gusts, but the layered canvas and hay lining absorbed and repelled it. Still, Amos knew the battle had only begun. By mid-morning, neighbors began to appear. First, it was Sila's again, struggling across the frozen valley with a sled piled high with feed. Then a small group of ranchers, bundled and wide-eyed, arrived, drawn by rumor and desperation. One by one, they approached the tent, eyes taking in the structure with a mix of awe and disbelief. "Amos, I don't understand," one older man said, shaking his head. "Cabins down the road, frozen solid, roofs collapsed. You're sitting here in warmth like nothing happened." Amos merely nodded, not proud, not defensive. "I know what winter can do," he said, voice low and steady. "I know how to keep it out." The ranchers stared at him, some incredulous, others fearful that his weird methods might be their only hope. Amos ushered them inside, careful to maintain space around the stove. They shuffled in, boots clumping snow onto the floor, faces red from the cold, eyes darting to the layers of canvas and hay, the low crackle of fire filling the space. "Don't touch the walls," Amos warned softly. "You'll compress them too much, lose the insulation. Treat it like a living thing." Inside, the warmth was intoxicating, almost unreal compared to the frozen world outside. One of the men, a younger rancher named Cole, lowered his hood and breathed deeply. It's like a furnace in here," he said, voice awed. "I can't feel my face, but everything else, it's warm." Amos gave a faint nod, tending to the stove. "Furnaces fail, heat escapes in unexpected ways. This is survival, not luxury." Even as he spoke, Amos could hear the storm pressing again. The wind tore across the plains, drifts piling higher, rattling old fences and collapsing barns that weren't prepared. He had no illusions. This winter didn't just threaten comfort, it threatened life itself. By afternoon, the valley had become a battlefield of snow and ice. Horses slipped and slid in hidden crusts, cattle huddled in barns that groaned under weight, and every cabin seemed to whisper defeat. Amos' tent, however, remained steadfast. He worked alongside neighbors now, reinforcing stakes, adjusting hay layers, teaching them how to respect the wind rather than fight it. "Why didn't anyone ever tell us?" Cole asked, shoveling a drift from a support line. "Why did we keep building like idiots when a little thought this," he gestured at the tent almost reverently, "would have saved us all?" Amos didn't answer immediately. He merely looked toward the horizon where gray clouds threatened further snow. "Because most people don't want to learn from winter," he said finally. "They think it's temporary, that it'll pass, but it doesn't care what you think." As night fell, the storm intensified. Snow whipped against the tent in furious sheets, hammering the canvas, rattling stakes, and piling drifts higher than any of them anticipated. Amos checked the stove, the fire still roaring and steady. Inside, the neighbors huddled, watching him, trying to understand the strange combination of wisdom and stubbornness that had created this sanctuary. Clara came in from outside, her hair dusted with snow, cheeks flushed. "Uncle, the others, they're freezing," she said, worry shadowing her face. "Some cabins, they're collapsing under the snow." Amos placed a gloved hand on her shoulder. "Then they need to learn, and fast." His eyes scanned the horizon. He had always known winter could be cruel, but this was a monster that demanded respect, attention, and relentless vigilance. He spent hours that night monitoring the tent, adjusting ropes, redistributing snow drifts with precise shoveling. The storm seemed to test him personally, sending heavier gusts, sharper temperatures, and relentless snow. Every creak in the canvas, every groan of the tent poles set his heart racing. One mistake could mean a breach, a loss of heat, and a trip into the frozen void outside. By the second night, the reality hit even the neighbors. One of the older ranchers, Thomas, admitted quietly, "I thought Amos was crazy. I thought this tent, there's no way. But it's warmer than my log cabin ever was. I don't know how you did it." Amos smiled faintly. "Old knowledge," he said simply. "Observation, preparation, layers, and stubbornness." Outside, the storm screamed its fury, snow piling against cabins, barns, and fences. Amos' tent, however, held its shape, 45 degrees warmer than any nearby structure. Each layer of canvas, each bale of hay, each aluminum panel had been placed deliberately, tested over years of harsh winters. And it worked. It wasn't magic, it was craft, ingenuity, and survival instinct made manifest. By the third day, frost had begun forming inside some cabins, glistening like cruel jewels, while Amos' tent remained temperate, a haven of human warmth amid the frozen hell. Neighbors had begun to trust him, following his instructions, helping reinforce his camp, learning the rhythms of snow, ice, and wind. Every adjustment, every handhold, every shove of a drift was a lesson. Amos stood outside for a moment, surveying the valley. His eyes traced cabins flattened under snow, barns half collapsed, and the tracks of horses and men buried in drifts. He could see the stakes of survival clearly: preparation, respect, and the courage to do something no one else had thought Orth doing. You've got to fight, he murmured to himself. You can't just sit inside a log cabin and hope winter leaves you alone. Later that evening, a sudden gust slammed against the tent, stronger than any before. Amos' heart tightened. He rushed inside to check the stove, the ropes, the hay layers. The neighbors followed, fear etched into their faces. "This one's worse than I thought," Thomas muttered, voice tight. "I've never seen snow like this." Amos nodded. He didn't need to argue. He could feel it, the wind testing him, trying to break through to expose flaws. He worked tirelessly, reinforcing stakes, tightening lines, and instructing the others. The warmth inside the tent persisted, stubborn and unyielding, while the storm raged outside. By midnight, Amos was exhausted, but he refused to sleep fully. Every creak, every shift in the wind, every drifting mound of snow was a threat. Yet in that small, bizarre structure, the tent held. 45 degrees warmer than the surrounding cabins. 45 degrees closer to life than death. And as he finally allowed himself a brief rest, eyes half closed by fatigue, Amos knew this was only the beginning. Winter had thrown its worst at him, but it wasn't done. The storm would return, fiercer. Tests would come that required more than ingenuity, endurance, courage, and the stubborn heart of a man who refused to bow to the cold. The tent, ridiculous and unconventional, was more than shelter now. It was a symbol, a lesson, a living proof that preparation and understanding could bend nature's harshest rules. And Amos, lean and weathered, had every intention of making sure everyone around him learned that lesson before it was too late. The storm hit like a hammer at dawn. Amos woke to the tent shuddering violently, snow drifts piling faster than he could count. The wind howled across the plains like a living thing, gnawing at the canvas, tugging at stakes, and rattling the reinforced poles. Outside, the world had disappeared. Every fence, every tree, every familiar shape was swallowed by white. Even the horizon seemed lost to the storm's appetite. Inside the tent, the air remained warm, but it wasn't safe to linger. Amos had taught the neighbors well enough. They knew that survival meant action. "Everyone outside," he barked, voice tight and controlled. "We're redistributing snow, now." Eyes widened, fear curled in stomachs. One of the younger ranchers, Cole, stammered, "But the wind, it's—" Amos cut him off. "We don't fight the wind, we respect it. Move." Bundled in every layer they had, the group emerged into the blinding white, shovels, ropes, and sleds in hand. Snow tore at their faces, ice bit through gloves, and every step threatened to sink them into drifts that rivaled the height of wagons. Yet the tent stood, a strange beacon of warmth and hope. Amos led the effort, climbing to the higher drift, hands raw and shaking as he worked to lighten the pressure pressing against the fabric walls. "Careful," Amos shouted. "Don't let it collapse all at once." The wind roared in reply, a savage counterpoint to every careful shove. Snow avalanched in controlled sections, but one massive sheet slipped unexpectedly. Amos lunged, shoving against the weight with every ounce of strength. His boots slipped, hands burned, and a sharp edge of ice sliced across his cheek. He gritted his teeth and held. The tent creaked and groaned, the stakes bending but holding. "Amos," Clara yelled from below, her voice almost lost in the storm. "The south wall." He swung his gaze. The canvas on the southern edge had begun to sag alarmingly, bulging beneath the weight of ice and packed snow. The stakes groaned, and for a heartbeat he feared the structure might fail entirely. The neighbors froze, watching him with wide eyes, unsure whether to act or pray. Amos didn't hesitate. He ran the rope, bracing it against the drift, and began tying supports, knots thick with urgency. The storm seemed to sense resistance, gusts intensifying, snow pelting their faces, cutting like needles. Every movement was agony. Cole slipped, nearly losing a rope, and Amos lunged, catching him by the coat just before he toppled into a drift. "Keep moving, no hesitation," Amos shouted, voice hoarse. Hours passed in a relentless rhythm of digging, shoveling, bracing, and tying. Snow slid in controlled avalanches, yet every attempt to redistribute it revealed how merciless winter could be. Amos' arms burned, his fingers numb beyond pain, his legs trembling from exertion. Still he worked, eyes scanning every inch of canvas, every pole, every hay layer inside. One misstep could collapse the tent, and with it the only safe haven for everyone present. Inside, the stove's warmth threatened to fade in memory alone. Amos had refused to let anyone inside for more than brief moments, knowing the danger of neglecting the storm's power. He moved like a conductor, orchestrating shovels, ropes, and human effort against a force that didn't negotiate. Then came a sharp, terrifying sound, a deep tearing from above. Amos' heart jumped. The northern drift had shifted massively, a wall of snow pressing with unnatural force. He grabbed the nearest rope, bracing his body against the shove, shouting, "Now, pull it to the east." The group surged in unison, muscles straining, voices raw, until the drift began to give, sliding away in a controlled cascade. Amos' boots skidded on ice, snow clinging to the brim of his hat, wind tearing at his coat. He felt a brief surge of hope, until the tent shuddered violently again, almost buckling entirely. "Brace the poles," he roared. Hold it now." Every second stretched into eternity. Amos, lungs burned, heart racing as frost crept across his beard and hair. The neighbors pressed against the poles and ropes, muscles quivering, shovels digging furiously to lighten pressure. It was a test of endurance, of will, of stubborn human defiance against nature's cruelest hand. Minutes, or was it hours, passed in tense silence punctuated by the roar of the storm and the groan of canvas and wood. Amos felt sweat freeze on his forehead, every movement agonizing. Then, gradually, imperceptibly, the drift settled, pressure eased, and the tent's walls stiffened again. The storm had not won, not yet. Amos dropped to his knees, chest heaving, hands trembling. Around him, the neighbors were pale, frozen, exhausted, but alive. The warmth inside the tent persisted, stubborn and faithful, a fragile victory against chaos. Amos, it held, Thomas breathed, voice hoarse with disbelief. The tent it actually held. Amos nodded, though he hardly felt the triumph yet. He was too aware of the fragility, the razor-thin margin by which they had survived. "Not luck," he said simply. "Preparation, knowledge, and stubbornness." The night stretched on. Outside, the storm raged still, but the immediate threat had passed. Amos, drenched in sweat and snow, moved inside to check the fire, adding wood, tending to the stove, ensuring every inch of insulation remained effective. One by one, the neighbors settled into the small spaces between hay bales and canvas, trying to recover from adrenaline and exhaustion. "You're a miracle worker," Cole whispered, eyes wide as he watched Amos check the stove. "Seriously, I don't know anyone else who could have done this." Amos shook his head. "Not a miracle, just respect for winter and the willingness to work when everyone else panics." Hours later, as the storm finally began to wane, Amos stepped outside, boots crunching on the icy crust. The tent stood battered but unbroken, a small island of warmth in a sea of white chaos. He scanned the valley. Other cabins had partially collapsed. Barns caved under snow, fences snapped and twisted. But his little structure, strange and weird to everyone who had ever mocked it, had endured. He allowed himself a moment of quiet pride, chest heaving, fingers raw, eyes tracing the horizon. The storm had pushed them to the edge, tested every ounce of endurance and every shred of ingenuity. And yet here they were, alive, warm, united. Behind him, the neighbors emerged cautiously from the tent, faces lit with awe and gratitude. Amos met each of their eyes, seeing fear, relief, and something deeper, respect, born from shared struggle and survival. "Tomorrow," Amos said softly, voice carrying through the crisp night, "we teach the others. We show them how to survive, how to respect winter, because this isn't over. Not really." The wind whispered in reply, a distant howl that promised more tests. Amos knew it would return, fiercer, relentless, but for now they had won. The tent, the preparation, and the stubborn heart of a man who refused to yield had protected them when everything else had failed. And as he looked at the canvas walls, packed with hay and ingenuity, he realized a truth that no frontier log cabin could teach. Survival didn't come from tradition or wealth or pride. Survival came from understanding, courage, and the willingness to do what others thought weird, to stand apart from folly, to fight the storm on your own terms, and to refuse to give up no matter the odds. The night was long, the storm still whispering threats beyond the tent, but inside life endured. Warmth persisted. Hope endured. And in that strange, weird tent, 45 degrees warmer than any frontier log cabin, they had found the difference between mere existence and survival. The sun rose pale and hesitant over the frozen plains. Snow sparkled in the morning light like scattered diamonds, crisp and unyielding under the boots of the survivors. Amos stepped outside the tent, shoulders stiff from exhaustion, chest still heaving from the previous night's battle with winter. The storm had receded, leaving behind silence so complete it felt unnatural, almost sacred. The tent stood proud, the canvas taut, the hay-packed walls bulging. Slightly but holding firm, Amos ran his hand along the exterior, feeling the residual warmth seeping through the frozen fibers. Every inch of the structure told the story of struggle, torn fabric, patched canvas, reinforced poles. But it was alive. It had survived what others had deemed impossible. Inside, the neighbors stirred, rubbing sore muscles, sipping lukewarm coffee, and exchanging exhausted smiles. Cole peeked out from the corner, still pale but alive. I can't believe we made it," he said, voice shaking. Amos shook his head, brushing snow from his coat. "Believe it, but don't forget it. Winter doesn't forgive mistakes. You learn or you don't survive." The children, who had come along with families seeking shelter, emerged from the warmth of blankets and hay, blinking against the brightness of the morning. Their eyes were wide, reflecting a mixture of awe and lingering fear. Amos crouched down, smiling gently. "You made it," he said softly. "Safe, that's what matters." The neighbors began the slow task of checking on the rest of their homesteads. Most had fared poorly. Barns were half collapsed, fences snapped under the weight of ice and snow, and livestock had suffered. Amos watched, feeling a pang of guilt and gratitude intertwining in his chest. He had enough space, enough ingenuity, enough stubbornness to survive. Others had not. And he had been lucky, no, more than lucky, he had been prepared. By mid-morning, word began to spread across the plains. Radio crackles carried the news. Rancher Amos Whitaker and neighbors survive historic blizzard using reinforced canvas tent and unconventional insulation techniques. 45 degrees warmer than standard log cabins. Amos sighed, adjusting the straps on his pack. Fame, attention, recognition, none of it mattered. What mattered was that the people here had survived, that they had learned a lesson harsher than any winter school. Survival was about foresight, resourcefulness, and courage. Hank Dawson approached, boots crunching over the hard-packed snow. His face was ruddy from cold, beard frosted. "Amos, you saved us all," he said simply, awe in his voice. "I've never seen anything like it. That tent, it's a fortress." Amos shrugged, lips tight. "It's not the tent, it's the preparation, the willingness to fight when everyone else panics." Hank nodded, understanding that words weren't necessary to convey respect. Together, they walked the perimeter of the tent, inspecting the ice-laden walls, the reinforced poles, the stubborn pile of hay that had absorbed so much snow and pressure. Each feature was a testament to human ingenuity, patience, and stubborn foresight. By afternoon, neighbors began bringing supplies, extra canvas, spare lumber, rope, and food. They asked questions, took notes, photographed the structure. Amos answered patiently, demonstrating how the hay walls worked, how stakes were reinforced, how the tent retained heat even when the winds reached gale force. The lesson was clear. Traditional log cabins could collapse under such conditions, but innovation, attention to detail, and respect for nature could overcome even the harshest winters. In the quiet moments, Amos watched the children playing in the small, cleared space outside the tent, bundled tightly in layers, laughing despite frost-bitten cheeks. He felt a deep, almost aching pride. This wasn't just survival, it was life continuing, stubborn and bright in the face of adversity. Maggie, his oldest daughter, approached him, scarf wrapped tightly around her face. Her eyes were soft with exhaustion, but there was a light there, a recognition of the miracle they had all endured. "Dad," she said quietly, "we did it. We actually made it through the worst winter in 50 years." Amos shook his head, a faint smile breaking through the frost on his face. We did. But remember this, winter isn't done with us. You never stop respecting it, never stop preparing. The moment you think it's over, that's when you fail. Maggie nodded, understanding the weight of his words. She looked at the tent, at the neighbors, at the horizon stretching endless and white. Then we keep building, keep learning, she said. Together. The days that followed were a slow recovery. The snow slowly melted under the weak sun, revealing flattened fields, broken fences, and the first signs of spring beneath the winter's heavy hand. Amos and the neighbors worked side by side, repairing barns, reinforcing structures, and sharing knowledge. His tent remained standing, a symbol, a lesson, and a gathering place for those who wanted to learn how to survive. Not just endure, but survive intelligently. By the time the last snowbank had receded, the weird tent had become legendary. Ranchers from neighboring counties traveled to see it, asking Amos to teach them the techniques that had saved so many lives. School groups came, curious children pressing their faces to the canvas walls, listening to Amos' calm explanations of insulation, wind management, and the importance of preparation. Through it all, Amos remained humble. He didn't consider himself a hero. He had simply acted with the knowledge passed down through generations, combined with a stubborn refusal to yield. But he could see the impact in the eyes of those he had protected, the newfound respect for winter, for preparation, and for the quiet strength of a man willing to defy convention when survival depended on it. Evenings became moments of reflection. Amos sat by the fire inside the tent, warmth radiating gently from the hay-packed walls. He watched the wind stir the grass outside, listened to the soft chatter of neighbors, and let the tension of the past week slowly drain from his body. The winter had tried to break them, had tested every nerve and muscle, had threatened life itself, and yet they had endured. Jacob, his grandson, sat beside him, eyes wide with admiration. "Grandpa, I never want to forget this," he said softly. "The way you fought the storm, it's incredible." Amos reached out, placing a calloused hand on Jacob's shoulder. "Remember this, kid," he said gently. "It's not about being incredible. It's about being prepared, staying calm, and never giving up. Nature's strong, but stubbornness and brains can be stronger." As spring returned to the plains, the ranch began to thrive again. The cattle grazed on newly exposed grass, fences repaired, barns standing tall. Amos' tent, once laughed at and dismissed as weird, became a symbol, a reminder that ingenuity, preparation, and courage could defy even the harshest elements. The lesson traveled far beyond the ranch. Survival wasn't just about shelter. It was about knowledge, foresight, and the willingness to do what others wouldn't. And for Amos, the man who had stared down 50 years' worth of winters and survived the fiercest of them all, there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that the tent, the preparation, and his stubborn heart had saved more than just lives. They had preserved hope. He pressed his hand against the warm canvas, feeling the faint residual heat, and allowed himself a rare smile. The winter had been relentless, unforgiving, and terrifying, but they had met it head-on, and in the strange, weird tent 45 degrees warmer than any frontier log cabin, they had won. Outside, the wind whispered through the plains, softer now, as if acknowledging defeat. Inside, life continued, warm and steady, and for the first time in weeks, Amos let himself believe they had truly survived. The frontier would always be harsh, the winters unforgiving, but one thing was clear. With knowledge, courage, and a little stubbornness, survival wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. And the story of the weird tent would live on, teaching generations that sometimes the unconventional way is the only way to survive the impossible. The tent had survived. The people had survived. The winter, the fiercest in half a century, had been outwitted by preparation, ingenuity, and human grit. And in that survival, something deeper endured, a legacy of hope, resilience, and the quiet power of stubborn determination. The story of Amos and his weird tent spread across the plains, inspiring ranchers, families, and anyone who believed they couldn't endure nature's harshest tests. But for Amos, it was simple. He had done what needed to be done. He had kept his people alive, warm, and safe, and in doing so had proven that even in the deadliest winter, survival belonged to those willing to think differently, act decisively, and never give up.